I still remember the sound that piece of paper made when I peeled it off my front gate. Funny how something so light can feel heavier than a century of family history. It was bright yellow, laminated like they expected it to survive the rain longer than my house ever would, and across the top in bold black letters it read, "Mandatory Demolition Notice." According to the homeowners association that had sprung up around my family's farm, my home was officially an eyesore, a threat to property values, and scheduled to be removed within 90 days. They thought they were sending a warning. What they actually did was wake up the wrong woman. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I'm 53 years old, and I live on the same 4 acres my great-grandfather cleared with a team of mules back in 1908. The old farmhouse isn't fancy. The pine siding turned silver decades ago. The front porch leans just enough to make visitors nervous, and every floorboard has a story if you know where to listen. There's a faded red barn behind it, an old steel windmill that hasn't pumped water in years but still squeaks whenever the prairie wind rolls through, and 3 retired quarter horses that spend most of their days pretending they have somewhere important to be. Every morning starts the same for me. Coffee before sunrise, feed the horses, check the fences, then head into town where I spend most of my day wearing a blazer instead of muddy boots. People always looked surprised when they learned that the woman driving the dusty pickup into the pasture every evening also happened to be the president of one of the oldest community banks in the county. I never cared much about impressing anybody. The farm was home, the bank was family, and somehow I learned to love both worlds without feeling like I belonged entirely to either. Everything around me changed 5 years earlier when Cedar Ridge Estates showed up almost overnight. Empty pasture became hundreds of identical houses with fresh sod, decorative mailboxes, white vinyl fences, and perfectly trimmed bushes that somehow all looked exactly the same. They built walking trails, fountains, pickleball courts, a clubhouse with stone columns that looked expensive until you touched them, and then they wrapped the whole neighborhood inside an HOA that promised residents perfection. I wasn't invited to join, mostly because my property had been there long before theirs existed, but that didn't stop some of the newer homeowners from acting like I was the guest. At first it was little things. Someone complained that my tractor was visible from the walking trail. Another person wanted my barn painted because faded red wasn't part of the neighborhood color palette. One woman actually knocked on my door holding a brochure and smiled while telling me, "You'd be amazed how much your place would improve with some modern updates." I smiled back and told her. My grandfather said the same thing about indoor plumbing. She laughed because she thought I was joking. I wasn't. Most people eventually learned to wave when they drove by. Others never stopped staring. The only person who seemed determined to erase my farm entirely was the HOA president, Daniel Crawford. Daniel had moved from Phoenix a few years earlier, spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, and loved introducing himself by his title before his name. Every conversation with him felt like he was pitching a business deal nobody asked for. Progress requires sacrifice, he'd say whenever someone questioned one of his projects. The first time we met, he stood at my fence line wearing polished loafers that sank into the mud after one step. He looked around my property like a real estate investor inspecting a foreclosure. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, folding his sunglasses into his shirt pocket, "have you ever considered selling? The community could make excellent use of this land." I scratched my border collie behind the ears before answering. "My family already is making excellent use of it." He forced a smile. "Things change." I nodded. "They do. That's why this place matters." His smile disappeared before he turned around and walked back to his SUV. I didn't think much of it after that, but looking back now, I think that was the moment he decided my farmhouse had become his personal project. 3 days after finding the demolition notice, I started making calls instead of arguments. Getting angry is easy. Finding facts takes patience. I spoke with county officials, an old surveyor who'd known my father, 2 retired board members, and eventually someone inside the HOA office who probably regretted answering the phone. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Daniel had pushed the demolition vote through during a special meeting with barely enough board members present to reach quorum. The engineering report claiming my house threatened neighborhood values was only 2 pages long. No licensed engineer's signature. No certification stamp. No inspection photographs. Just opinions dressed up like evidence. That bothered me, but not nearly as much as something else I couldn't stop thinking about. That neighborhood had appeared almost overnight, Yet projects like roads, drainage systems, parks, and clubhouses don't build themselves. Somebody had financed every inch of it. That thought stayed with me all evening while I sat on my porch watching the sunset wash across the pasture. I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me that every building tells two stories, the one people can see and the one hidden inside the paperwork. My father had spent 40 years teaching me banking wasn't about money nearly as much as it was about memory. Read every page, he'd always tell me. The page that saves you is usually the one everyone else skipped. As darkness settled across the fields, I finished my coffee, looked out toward the lights of Cedar Ridge glowing beyond my fences, and suddenly remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. My father hadn't just financed local farms. He'd financed the entire subdivision before he passed away. I set my coffee cup down, grabbed my truck keys, and drove straight into town, because if my memory was right, somewhere inside the old loan archives was a file that Daniel Crawford had absolutely no idea existed, and by sunrise, I intended to find it. I unlocked the bank a little before 5 the next morning, long before the first teller would arrive, and for the first time in years I walked past my office without turning on the lights. The basement archive was where I was headed. My grandfather used to joke that real history wasn't written in books. It was filed in banker boxes with coffee stains and fading labels. Down there, every loan, every deed, every handshake that had eventually become a contract was waiting on steel shelves. Dust floated through the beam of my flashlight as I worked my way to the commercial lending section, running my fingers across faded labels until I found the one I was hoping hadn't been destroyed during the digital conversion. Cedar Ridge Development, there it was. I carried the box upstairs, set it on the conference table, poured myself another cup of coffee, and started reading. At first it looked exactly like every large development package I'd ever approved. Environmental studies, appraisals, construction schedules, engineering certifications, contractor insurance, repayment projections, page after page of perfectly ordinary paperwork. Then I found my father's handwritten notes in the margin, something he always did instead of using sticky notes. His handwriting leaned slightly to the right, neat enough that I could almost hear him talking while I read. Developers change. Contracts stay. I smiled without realizing it. For a moment it felt like he was sitting across the table wearing the same brown suit he wore every Monday. I kept reading. The original loan had funded nearly every piece of infrastructure inside Cedar Ridge. Roads, storm drainage, street lighting, recreation facilities, water retention systems. Everything the neighborhood proudly advertised had been built with money from our bank. Outstanding balance, just over $6 million. 23 years remained. Monthly payment, just under $32,000. I turned another page, then another, until I reached the covenant section. My pulse slowed. Lawyers like to hide the important parts in language nobody enjoys reading, but bankers learn to enjoy exactly that. Page 46 contained standard default language. 47 was different. My father's initials sat beside a paragraph he'd personally negotiated. I read it once, then again, then a third time just to make sure I wasn't letting hope rewrite the words. The bank reserved the right to accelerate the remaining balance immediately if the borrower knowingly engaged in conduct intended to unlawfully interfere with bank assets, materially damage property belonging to the Mercer family, or act in bad faith toward protected interests specifically identified within the agreement. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My father, that stubborn old man. He'd never forgotten that our farm sat directly beside the land eventually sold to developers. He'd anticipated the possibility that someday someone would try to pressure us off our land. He hadn't tried to predict the future. He'd simply written one sentence that protected it. I laughed out loud, alone in that conference room. "You sneaky old cowboy," I whispered. By 8:30, my attorney, Frank Delaney, walked into my office carrying 2 breakfast burritos and wearing the expression of a man who already knew I hadn't called him in for pleasant conversation. Frank had represented our family for almost 30 years. He took one look at the open file spread across my desk and raised an eyebrow. "Who are we suing?" "Nobody," I answered. "At least not today." I slid page 47 toward him. He adjusted his glasses, read quietly for several minutes, then slowly lowered the papers. "Well," he finally said, "that's one way to solve an HOA problem. We spent most of the morning reviewing every possible challenge Daniel's attorney might raise. Was the clause enforceable? Yes. Had the HOA inherited the developer's obligations? Yes. Could they argue the demolition order wasn't directed specifically at my family? Not after the language they used in the notice. Frank smiled for the first time all morning. Your father really didn't like leaving loose ends. Neither do I replied. By lunchtime, the acceleration notice was finished. It wasn't dramatic. Contracts never are. 4 pages. Professional language. Remaining principal due in full within 60 calendar days. Accrued interest included. Failure to comply would trigger foreclosure proceedings under the terms of the original agreement. No threats. No insults. Just consequences they had already agreed to years before. Instead of mailing it, I drove to the HOA office myself. Daniel's assistant recognized me immediately and looked nervous before I even spoke. Is Mr. Crawford available? She hesitated. Do you have an appointment? I smiled politely. No, but I think he'll want to see me. 5 minutes later, Daniel walked into the lobby with the same confident stride I'd seen a dozen times before. Mrs. Mercer, he said, have you reconsidered our proposal? I handed him the envelope. Actually, I think you're the one who should reconsider. He opened it casually, expecting another complaint. Halfway through the first page, his smile faded. By the second page, he wasn't reading anymore. He was searching. His eyes darted across each paragraph, looking for some sentence that would make the rest disappear. Then he flipped to the final page where my signature rested beneath the bank seal. He looked back up at me. This has to be some kind of joke. No, I answered. The demolition notice was the joke. This is the contract. His face flushed bright red. You're abusing your position. No, Daniel. I'm exercising one my family negotiated before you even knew this county existed. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you realize what $6 million means? I met his stare without moving. Do you realize what 118 years means? Neither of us spoke after that. I simply turned around and walked out while he remained standing in the lobby holding papers that suddenly weighed a whole lot more than laminated demolition notices. News travels faster than weather in a small town. By the end of the week, everyone knew something had happened between the HOA and First Heritage Community Bank, even if they didn't know exactly what. I stayed quiet. Let people speculate. Daniel didn't. 8 days later, Cedar Ridge held an emergency board meeting inside the clubhouse. Residents packed every chair and lined the walls. I attended quietly and sat in the back. Daniel stood at the podium pretending everything remained under control. The bank's recent demand, he announced, is nothing more than intimidation designed to interfere with the authority of this association. Murmurs filled the room. Then someone near the front raised his hand. Is the loan real? Daniel hesitated just a little too long. Yes. Another resident spoke up. Can they actually call it? This time the silence lasted even longer. Finally he answered. Our legal counsel is reviewing the matter. That wasn't the answer people wanted. You could feel confidence draining out of the room one person at a time. An older gentleman stood up and said exactly what everyone else was thinking. Why are we trying to tear down a farmhouse that was here before any of us? Nobody answered him. A young mother sitting nearby quietly added, My kids love seeing the horses when we drive by. Another resident nodded. Mine too. Suddenly the conversation wasn't about property values anymore. It was about whether they'd been manipulated into fighting a neighbor who had never actually harmed them. 12 days after delivering the notice, my office phone rang. Frank transferred the call without saying much. On the other end was the HOA's attorney. His voice sounded exhausted. We skipped the small talk. Mrs. Mercer, he began carefully. My clients cannot satisfy the outstanding balance within the acceleration period. I assumed that, I replied. They're interested in discussing alternatives. I looked out my office window toward the old courthouse across the street. Good, I said calmly, because I've already written one. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a neatly bound proposal I'd finished the night before. 26 pages. Every condition carefully considered, every paragraph reviewed twice. I hadn't spent the past week planning revenge. I'd spent it making sure nobody would ever be foolish enough to threaten that farmhouse again. The negotiation took place the following Tuesday inside our bank's old boardroom, the same room where my grandfather used to approve cattle loans with nothing more than a handshake and a man's reputation. This time there were no handshakes waiting on the table. Daniel sat at one and looking like he hadn't slept in a week. The remaining board members looked somewhere between embarrassed and terrified, and their attorney kept flipping through my proposal, hoping he had missed something. He hadn't. I let the silence settle before speaking. I'm not here to punish an entire neighborhood, I said. I'm here because one board decided they had the right to erase my family's history. Daniel leaned forward. You could have just sued us. I looked at him for a second before answering. And you could have just knocked on my door. That seemed to land harder than anything my lawyer had said all morning. One by one we walked through every condition. The first extended the loan, making the monthly payments manageable instead of impossible. The second permanently recognized my property as protected agricultural land, exempt from any future architectural or demolition actions by the HOA. The third established a historical preservation fund that would contribute every year toward maintaining the farmhouse, barn, and surrounding acreage, not because I needed their money, but because I wanted every future board to remember the price of trying to destroy something they didn't understand. Another provision required that any future rule affecting neighboring non-HOA properties receive independent legal review before a vote could even be scheduled. Then came the condition Daniel hated most. He read it twice before throwing the papers onto the table. You're banning me? He snapped. For 10 years, I answered calmly. You abused your position. Leadership has consequences. He laughed, but there wasn't any confidence left in it. This is personal. I shook my head. No, Daniel. The demolition notice was personal. This is business. Nobody rushed to defend him. In fact, several board members avoided making eye contact altogether. One woman quietly admitted she had voted with Daniel because she believed an engineering report existed. Another confessed she'd never even seen my property before voting. An older gentleman cleared his throat and looked directly at me. Mrs. Mercer, I owe you an apology. We trusted the wrong person. That mattered more than I expected. Not because it erased what had happened, but because it reminded me something my father always believed. Institutions don't make bad decisions. People do, and sometimes good people simply follow the loudest voice in the room. After nearly 4 hours of discussion, their attorney closed his folder and looked around the table. Ladies and gentlemen, you have 2 choices. Accept these terms, or prepare for a financial disaster this association is unlikely to survive. The vote happened right there. One by one, hands went up. Yes, 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 yes. One final pause, then another yes. Only Daniel voted no. It didn't matter anymore. Before the meeting officially ended, he quietly removed the HOA president's badge from his jacket and placed it on the polished oak table. Nobody stopped him as he stood up and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned around. You're going to regret humiliating me. I smiled politely. No, Daniel. I protected my family. What you do next is entirely up to you. He walked out without another word, and somehow the room felt lighter the second the door clicked shut behind him. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. The relationship between my farm and the neighborhood slowly changed. Families started stopping by during the fall to buy pumpkins and fresh eggs. Kids would wave at the horses through the fence, and with their parents' permission, I'd sometimes let them feed carrots to old Daisy, who loved attention almost as much as she loved treats. The HOA planted native trees along the walking trail instead of decorative imports, and someone even suggested adding a small sign explaining that the Mercer farm had been part of the county's history long before Cedar Ridge existed. I agreed on one condition. The sign wouldn't have my name on it. History isn't supposed to belong to one person. One Saturday morning, almost a year later, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the neighborhood teenagers. It read, "My grandpa grew up on a farm too. I didn't understand why yours mattered until all this happened. Thanks for not giving up." I folded the note and slipped it into the same desk drawer where my father used to keep his handwritten loan notes. Funny how the smallest pieces of paper sometimes become the ones you treasure most. Every now and then people still ask if I enjoyed winning. The truth surprises them. Winning was never my favorite part. Watching people rediscover respect was. Because communities don't become stronger when every old building disappears. They become stronger when progress learns how to stand beside history instead of bulldozing over it. These days, I still sit on that same front porch most evenings with a cup of coffee in my hand, listening to the wind creak through the old mill while the lights of Cedar Ridge glow in the distance. From where I sit, neither one of us looks like the enemy anymore. We simply look like neighbors who finally learned that living beside each other is a lot easier than trying to erase one another. But I'll leave you with this. If you had been sitting in my chair that morning, holding a demolition notice for the home your family had protected for more than 100 years, would you have called the loan? Or would you have fought another way? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this are never as black and white as people think. And if you've ever seen power, pride, or bureaucracy go too far in your own community, I'd love to hear your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next one.